we look at these guys up in the top of the screen right here, a shell pitches directly between two men who, once the camera restarts, are not there anymore. These are almost certainly casualties of the fight. Very heavy bombardment. We can also see men clearly running with some real purpose. This isn't somebody just playing up for the cameras. This is very likely actual footage of an Allied bombardment of the lines.
Hi guys, I'm Dan Hill, a military historian specialising in the history of the First World War. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the archives to explore raw, unedited battlefield footage from the German perspective. So let's get straight into it.
This is a German film. It's taken probably between 1914 and about 1916. Silent, of course, as all films were at the time, but it's full of fascinating bits. Let's have a little explore a few of those bits as we go through, starting off with a great shot, actually. Let's just pause really briefly on that for a second. We're seeing here troops marching up in formation and wearing the famous pickle helm, which dates this as a quite early war film. Could be 1914, could be as late as 1916. But what's interesting is that these men are wearing their battlefield covers, so it suggests that they are going into action. Normally a pickle helm would have been leather. Later in the war, you get like a felt version, an ersatz version. But the leather and the spike both have a cover which goes over, like a canvas or cloth cover. Usually gives the regimental number on it. But also something worth pointing out here is the amount of dust those guys were kicking up as they're moving down the road. Really important, because actually movement on pre-tarmac roads, so non-asphalted roads, it's really problematic. You can get spotted very, very quickly with large numbers of troops moving, whether it be they infantry or cavalry. So a real consideration. German band there. Normally, bandsmen will double as stretcher bearers within an infantry battalion as well, which is worth considering. So they give a little bit extra manpower to the infantry, at least in terms of getting their own wounded off the battlefield. Starting off with a shot from East Prussia here, which is interesting. There's an Eastern and Western war at that point. There's an Eastern and Western front eventually, but most of German army's strength actually ends up going west at the very outset of the war in the famous Schlieffen Plan, which is designed to knock out the French army and the Belgians and the British, if they get involved, within about 6 weeks of the war commencing, before the entire bulk of the German army, like these guys are, turn eastwards and then start their advance at what the Germans assume will be the slower to mobilize enemy, that is the Russians. Heavily relying on horse-drawn vehicles at this point, as you can imagine. All armies do at the start of the war, but it really is a crossover. By the end of the war, the British Army, for example, employs more trucks than it does horses. Good Western Front shot here. French troops with, if this was a colour image, what would have certainly been the famous red trousers, acting as infantry, moving into Belgium to try and block the German advance, the sickle thrust of the Schlieffen Plan. Very early war though, they've got kepis on here, so no steel helmets at this point. Looks like German troops around some town, possibly in Belgium, possibly in France, making use of the fact that there's a fountain nearby to get cleaned up. Great shot here. Just pausing that for a second as well. This is quite iconic. If you look at the pipe that this guy's carrying, typically German of the period, late 1800s, early 1900s, Germans have all kinds of crazy pipes, and we see this out on the Western Front a lot. This very distinctive style of pipe that was very popular amongst frontline troops. This one's quite modest, actually. Some of them are really ridiculous. Using a piano in a bit of downtime. Bear in mind, this is originally a German piece of material, and so it's talking about refugees under French bombardment. The truth of this is that actually by far the most brutal acts against civilians were by the Germans themselves. Belgium, what's known today as the Rape of Belgium, and some really horrific events take place in early 1914 against the local population. These are probably refugees who were trying to get away from the German army, who've then been overtaken by it on the road. So we see huge movement of people in 1914, almost exclusively away from the oncoming German threat. And these guys have clearly been overtaken by the Germans. But it gives you an idea. This is somebody who's left their home and they've put all of their worldly possessions in a wheelbarrow and trying to move along the road with that. This is literally all that they've got left. It's pretty tragic to see, actually. The famous railway guns. This one was showing a bit of damage, actually. You can see some battle damage there, some shrapnel, which has pierced the armour of the train. But some of the guns that we see, this one, let's just pause on that for a second. Contre la Grosse Bertha is against the Big Bertha. The Big Bertha is a German railway gun, type of German railway gun, which has a massive caliber, something like 40 centimetres. About, what does it work out? Maybe a 14-inch gun, 15-inch gun, something like that. Can fire over devastating periods and launches a massive shell. Both the Germans and the French are going to employ those throughout the war. But you can imagine the damage of a 900-kilo shell getting thrown 11 miles can do. And these things were absolutely enormous. They were so big they had to be brought in and out of action using railways. So these are the classic kind of thing we see here. And this is German troops on a captured French one. And you can see this guy on the gun barrel here. I love that. Let's pause that for a second. You can see his mate down here winding. And I presume the guy on the top doesn't realize he's going to wind it that high because he's going to be sliding off in a second if he's not careful. But yeah, light-hearted young lads in a war zone. You know, they were light-hearted in many ways. Let's come on to this shot here. This is the star of the show, really, as far as this reel goes. And in fact, it's the star of the show almost in terms of all Great War footage, all First World War footage. Absolutely unique. The story of actually how this came about itself is fascinating. It was a military attaché, an American military attaché, who served in Berlin in, I think, 1919, 1920, just after the First World War. He asked for a reel from the German archives at Potsdam to take home as a souvenir with him, and he was given 4. In fact, we can even go through some of these documents. Maybe we'll do that in a minute because it gives an idea of actually how important this particular piece of film footage is, because effectively it is raw, uncut First World War battle footage, which, yes, there is stuff about, but a lot of the time it's staged. This stuff is not. This is absolutely legitimate battlefield footage. And let's go through it and then maybe talk about how exactly that comes about. Here we're seeing probably British shells exploding. That puff of white smoke, that suggests that these are British shells landing. Germans tend to use a slightly different type of explosive, which tends to leave a grey or even black smoke when the shell explodes, whereas British tend to use white. And so we do see the difference there. This is kind of a classic trench network. German troops with steel helmets on, we see running for their lives here. Possibly, and this is a strange one. Let's pause for a second. This is a strange one to understand, because at face value, what we're looking at is a German photographer, a German cameraman, in an elevated position, which itself is pretty risky, facing what to me looks like it might well be towards the British trenches, which are over in this direction, kind of a smudge of white out towards the horizon, with this darker patch being probably no man's land, and then a German trench system directly in front of us. But if you look, all of the guys running across here are almost exclusively running left to right across the screen. It doesn't quite work. And if the trenches were to the left, this guy who's literally taking the images here is in a pretty dangerous position because he's presumably facing along the front lines. But right here that we're looking at right now, almost certainly directly ahead of us is the enemy front lines. So why there's this left to right movement, we're not really sure. It's unusual in that way. But you can see shells landing, you can see men running, and you can see them getting into trench systems. And let's just have a look at this one shot here, because this is the clue to understanding whether something has been staged as to whether it might actually be real. And there's a couple of considerations here. One, there's a hell of a lot of shells being fired. If this is staged, that's a very expensive staging of shots, and that doesn't happen very often. But really the clue is in a particular explosion. It's kind of tragic in a way. If we look at these guys up in the top of the screen right here, a shell pitches directly between 2 men who, once the camera restarts, are not there anymore. These are almost certainly casualties of the fight. Very heavy bombardment. We can also see men clearly running with some real purpose. This isn't somebody just playing up for the cameras. This is very likely actual footage of an Allied bombardment of the lines. Extremely powerful stuff. Camera's panned slightly to the right here, so in the same spot, but we're looking further to the right. And again, bombardment of shells going down directly on the front line, perhaps slightly into no man's land by the looks of things. You can just see the volume of fire. The destruction's absolutely unbelievable. Tens and hundreds of millions of shells of that are fired throughout the Great War. And even here, this shot is really interesting as well. It gives us a couple of little clues too. You can see just in the foreground here what looks like it may well be a dugout entrance. Now, to understand where the enemy positions are, you can actually use dugout entrances as an example. Because the one thing that they're never doing is they're never dug so that the entrance is facing the enemy. It'd be way too dangerous to have a shell drop directly down into it. They're always dug towards the enemy. And so this one would suggest that the trenches in the background that we think we can just see a little white outline of here, which is very likely the chalk from where they've been dug down into, is more than likely going to be the British front line. It's also possible that gas is being used here. Sometimes gas is used in a format which is designed specifically to inundate an area and simply just to get guys to put their gas masks on, because as a soldier, much less effective when wearing a gas mask, particularly an early one. But also they may be mixed in with high explosives, or they may even be mixed in with smoke, which just creates a much worse condition to be in. We should point out at this stage of the war, until 1916, this is likely to be phosgene gas, possibly chlorine, delivered by shell with an impact fuse, and that's what we maybe are seeing here with this white puff of smoke, but it's difficult to tell. One thing that it isn't is mustard gas. Mustard gas is an airburst, and it's not actually a gas, it's more like a liquid. If you imagine a spray bottle or something like that, it's an oily liquid that coats the surface of the ground and is a blister agent. So we wouldn't see that same effect with mustard, and it's very likely too early in the war for that. Huge explosions though coming in. You can see the ground is pretty much cleared of troops as well, which is interesting and again suggests that this might be legitimate battlefield footage. These guys are simply not going to be here. They're going to be down in dugouts, down in bunkers, staying out of the way with a heavy bombardment like this coming in. It's believed to be taken on the Somme in 1916, which looks about right for the area and for the terrain. And pause again here for a second. We can also see that the cameraman is in some kind of protected position. Now, this could be an aperture of a bunker, it could be a building, could be a wrecked house, but clearly there's something here that's protecting the cameraman. And it's where he's getting his elevation from as well, which gives us a little bit of a better idea about how he managed to get that shot. The whole area crisscrossed with trenches. Of course, it's a very complex system.
Whilst we're going through this, I just want to quickly mention a really exciting new project that we're working on, a show called the Untitled History Podcast. Hosted by our team member Gareth Edwards, it's a brand new free podcast exploring some of the most interesting and unusual aspects from across history. Recently, I joined Gareth for a deep dive into the fascinating origin of words and phrases, many of which came from the Western Front. Be sure to check it out wherever you get your podcasts.
Just before we move on, let's talk a little bit about that shot, because that film is known as the Barrage film, and it's absolutely fascinating. And we know quite a lot about this. It was actually a big deal in the 1920s. Today, that footage is largely unknown, but it was a man by the name of Edward Davis, a cavalry colonel, who actually managed to source this footage. And we've got an original letter here which explains exactly where that particular film came from. And he says the following: I brought this film not from the Balkans, but from Berlin, where I was military attaché immediately following the World War. While in Berlin, I knew the Germans had a large stock of war films in their archives at Potsdam. Upon my departure in the autumn of 1921, I asked for one of these films as a souvenir, so to speak. They gave me not one, but 4. Among these was the one which I called the Barrage film, but which possibly in the Signal Corps is labelled as the Palestine film. If you want to read this out, we'll pause it and you can have the whole thing on screen. But he also goes on saying, worth bearing in mind that Davis here is actually a combat veteran, and he's a veteran cameraman as well. He's somebody that's been involved in this. And in fact, post-war, he goes around talking about his filming of the war. And he says here, in my judgment, no part of the Barrage film is faked, except possibly a few feet of an unimportant nature just at the end of the film. In this last part, the shape of the fragments of soil thrown up in the form of the general cone of dispersion caused me to believe that mines were used to aid the cameraman. Some enthusiast in the German pictorial service may have thought that these last feet enhanced the value of the picture. In my opinion, the contrary is the case, and I've often thought that I would cut off these last few feet as of no value and doubtful origin. Which is extremely interesting, but he goes on to say this: the main part of the Barrage film seems entirely genuine to me. And such is also the opinion of many experienced soldiers who have seen it, because, as you know, I have shown the film to many thousands of officers and enlisted men of the Army of the United States who served overseas and at all the schools, including your own signals school. If you will study the bursts carefully, you'll observe that there are bursts of projectiles and not of mines. The smoke, the debris, the general dispersion are all very correct, so to speak. If you'll also study the relationship between the lines of advance of the various squads of German infantry and the location of the shell bursts, the attitudes of the men, and the other minutiae, I think you will agree that the picture is genuine. Which is fascinating. And to get this from somebody who actually was there and understands exactly what we're looking at is extremely important. It's something that really adds a lot to this and actually makes this footage extremely important in itself, because we simply just don't find this when we come to the First World War. There's so little of this because it's so dangerous to obtain. But there's more to it. And let's just go through the last bits here. And let's start off with this, which is the very next scene, a German railway motor car. Literally a car which has been fitted to go onto rails. Not sure how popular they were, certainly weren't particularly common, but maybe this was for bringing troops up and down the line, maybe it was an officer's thing, maybe it was for bringing wounded up and down. But clearly there was one, we've just seen it. Destroyed French fort here, one of the pre-war forts. Notice the grass banks on the top, that's deliberate, that's so that they're much less easy to see from the air, and also the earth itself provides extra protection from shell fire and things like that. We have Pinon Castle here, which is in the N sector, so big French sector. Also American troops in this area for a while later in the war. We can see a German field hospital has been set up, a tented hospital. Interesting just here, let's just pause for a second on that. If you look at this guy at the back of the nearer of the two stretchers to us, this guy right here, you can see that he's wearing an Adrienne helmet, French army helmet, which suggests, given that this is German field hospital, this is a French prisoner who's fairly recently been brought in and has been used to transfer wounded, possibly French wounded, more likely German, back to the field hospital. And then cavalry. This is a great shot in many ways, actually. It's one of those strange things that we get with the First War. Cavalry is so often considered to be totally obsolete. Truth is, it's not really the case. Actually, it does have its place, both in 1914 and again at the end of the war in 1918. But one of the strange things to see here is troops carrying a lance, literally an old-fashioned lance that you would have seen with Roman soldiers a couple of thousand years before, whilst wearing steel helmets, the famous Stahlhelm. These guys are typically going to also be armed with rifles, though it's difficult to see if any of them were carrying them at the time. But think of them as a kind of quick reaction force. That's the role of the cavalry. And obviously it comes into its own once the battlefield opens up again in about 1918. And one more shot, the ever-present German artillery, this case the 77. This is the real workhorse of the German army. Very quick firing, distance covers about 5 miles, 8 kilometers, something like that. So long range, effective, and can put down a lot of fire, particularly when used like this in a battery. So there we are, the end of the reel. I found that fascinating. Hopefully you found something interesting in that as well. Thanks very much. Join us next time.